Before this video ends, you may realize something uncomfortable, that power doesn't corrupt the mind, it reveals it. Tonight, you're not watching a history lesson. You're stepping inside the mind of a ruler whose crown didn't elevate him, it crushed him. If you've ever wondered what absolute power does to the human psyche, why brilliant leaders descend into madness, then stay with us until the end. Because Ivan the Terrible's story isn't just about him. It's about what power would do to anyone, if left unchecked. If you're drawn to the darker truths of history and psychology, gently tap the like button. It tells YouTube to share this story with others who need to hear it. And before we begin, subscribe to Whispers of the Owls, because once you hear these stories, you'll never see power the same way again. Chapter 1. Before the Terror. Before the blood. Before the name the Terrible hardened into legend. There was a child. In the echoing halls of the Kremlin, power did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived with silence. A silence so heavy it pressed against the walls, watched from behind tapestries, and whispered through corridors where adults spoke softly, but plotted loudly. Ivan IV Vasilyevich was not born a monster. He was born into a throne already soaked in fear. At 3 years old, Ivan's father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died. Power did not wait for the boy to grow. It hovered above him like a blade suspended by thread. And when his mother, Elena Glinskaya, died 5 years later, possibly poisoned, the thread snapped. What remained was a child crowned in name, but orphaned in reality. The boyars came next. Powerful noble families, Shuiskys, Belskys, men who smiled while tightening their grip on the state. They ruled around Ivan, not for him. They starved him of affection, mocked his vulnerability, ignored his pleas. Chroniclers record that Ivan and his younger brother were often left in rags, hungry, humiliated, wandering palace halls like unwanted ghosts. This is where the psychology of terror begins. A child learns the world by observing who is safe. Ivan learned that no one was. He watched servants beaten. He watched nobles dragged away for losing favor. He watched men kneel one day and vanish the next. And he learned a lesson far older than Russia itself. Power does not protect the weak. Power preys on them. When Ivan lashed out, they called him cruel. When he killed animals, they whispered madness. But psychology tells a darker truth. Cruelty, when learned young, is often rehearsal. A child mimics the only language authority has taught him. Fear. At 13, Ivan did something no one expected. He ordered the arrest of Prince Andrei Shuiskyi, one of the men who had tormented him for years. Shuiskyi was dragged outside and killed by dogs. The court was stunned. This was not rage. This was memory collecting interest. For the first time, Ivan tasted control. And it was intoxicating. When he was crowned Tsar of all Russia at 16, the first to ever hold that title, it was not just ambition. It was psychological armor. Tsar meant divinely appointed, untouchable, eternal. But crowns do not heal trauma. They magnify it. Early in his reign, Ivan surprised everyone. He governed with vision. He listened. He reformed. He expanded Russia's borders, modernized its laws, and sought unity over chaos. This was the Ivan history often forgets, the thoughtful ruler, the devout Christian, the intellectual who read deeply and wrote extensively. Yet beneath the surface, the child was still there, watching, remembering, keeping score. Power did not erase Ivan's fear, it validated it. Every threat felt real. Every disagreement felt like betrayal. Because when your childhood teaches you that safety is temporary, authority becomes obsession. And obsession always demands sacrifice. This is the first truth of the crown's psychological cost. Power does not transform who you are. It reveals what survived you. Ivan's early reign was not peace, it was restraint. A lid pressed tightly over a boiling mind. And history shows us, again and again, that pressure does not disappear. It waits. Chapter 2. Power did not teach Ivan fear. Fear taught Ivan power. Long before the crown rested on his head, terror had already made a home in his mind. Childhood was not a sanctuary for Ivan IV. It was a battlefield without rules, without mercy, and without witnesses who cared enough to intervene. Inside the Kremlin, young Ivan grew up surrounded by adults who understood one thing perfectly. A ruler without strength is a ruler to be used. And so they used him. The boyars fought endlessly for dominance, pulling the state in different directions while Ivan watched from the sidelines, powerless, humiliated, and ignored. Decisions were made over his head. His authority was ceremonial, his presence ornamental. When he spoke, they laughed. When he cried, they left. Psychology has a word for this kind of upbringing: chronic insecurity. But history has another word for what it creates when combined with absolute power: a tyrant. Ivan learned early that vulnerability invited violence, that kindness signaled weakness, that silence was safer than trust. He did not develop paranoia overnight. It was installed, piece by piece, through neglect and humiliation. The palace was full, yet Ivan was alone. Chroniclers describe him as withdrawn, brooding, prone to sudden bursts of rage. He would wander the halls at night, listening to whispered conspiracies, convinced that plots were unfolding just beyond his reach. And often, they were. This is what made Ivan's mind so dangerous later. His paranoia was not entirely delusional. It was trained. This is where the psychology becomes lethal. A child who grows up in constant danger does not ask, "Who can I trust?" He asks, "Who will betray me first?" Ivan's mind became a fortress: thick walls, narrow gates, and no mercy for those inside. He watched boyars rise and fall, noticing patterns others ignored. He learned that loyalty was temporary, alliances were transactional, and power was never shared. It was seized. And so Ivan began to practice power long before he ruled. He tortured animals. He tested cruelty. Not out of pleasure alone, but out of curiosity. What happens when I decide life or death? This was not madness. It was rehearsal. The boy was preparing for a world where mercy had never protected him. Religion, too, played a role in shaping Ivan's psyche. The Orthodox Church taught him that rulers were chosen by God, instruments of divine will. To a traumatized child, this belief was seductive. If God had chosen him, then his suffering had meaning. His pain was not neglect, it was destiny. And destiny does not apologize. By the time Ivan was crowned Tsar in 1547, the seeds of terror were already rooted deep. The coronation was magnificent: gold, incense, chanting. But inside Ivan's mind, something else was happening. For the first time, no one could ignore him. For the first time, the boyars had to kneel. For the first time, fear belonged to him. And fear, once tasted, rarely satisfies. It demands repetition. Yet the early years of Ivan's reign appeared hopeful. He surrounded himself with a council of reformers, men who spoke of law, order, and progress. He modernized Russia's legal code, limited the arbitrary power of nobles, and expanded the state with calculated brilliance. To the outside world, Ivan was a success story. But success does not cure trauma, it disguises it. Every reform carried suspicion. Every advisor was tested. Every victory sharpened his awareness that power could be taken as easily as it was gained. The child inside Ivan never stopped watching the exits. And then came the most dangerous moment of all: love. Anastasia Romanovna was not just a wife, she was a psychological anchor. Gentle, calming, stabilizing. In her presence, Ivan softened. His rages diminished. His fears quieted. For the first time since childhood, someone made him feel safe without demanding fear in return. And safety terrified him, because safety had always been temporary. When Anastasia fell ill and died in 1560, something inside Ivan shattered. He was convinced she had been poisoned by the boyars. Whether true or not mattered less than what it confirmed in his mind. Love was weakness, and weakness invited betrayal. From that moment forward, Ivan no longer ruled to build. He ruled to prevent loss. And a ruler driven by fear does not seek peace, he seeks control. The seeds planted in his childhood had finally found fertile ground. They were about to bloom into terror. Chapter 3. For a brief moment in history, Ivan IV appeared to defy his own darkness. This is the part of the story that unsettles historians the most, the era when the future tyrant ruled not through terror, but through vision, when fear had not yet devoured reason, when the crown still felt like purpose, not punishment. Ivan the Terrible was once simply Ivan the Brilliant. Crowned Tsar at 16, Ivan did something unprecedented. He declared himself not just ruler of Moscow, but Tsar of all Russia. The title carried divine authority, echoing Byzantine emperors and biblical kings. To Ivan, this was more than symbolism. It was psychological reclamation. After years of being ignored, dismissed, and humiliated, The crown became proof that the child had survived. And survival, when mistaken for destiny, becomes dangerous. Yet in these early years, Ivan ruled with clarity. He gathered around him a group of reform-minded advisors known as the Chosen Council. Together, they envisioned a centralized state governed by law rather than noble whim. For a traumatized ruler, structure felt like safety. The Sudebnik of 1550 was introduced, a new legal code designed to curb corruption and standardize justice. For the first time, Russia moved toward a system where power answered to rules, not moods. Ivan established the Zemsky Soba, an assembly representing various social classes, giving the illusion, however limited, of shared governance. Illusion matters. It buys time. Militarily, Ivan was relentless and effective. He reorganized the army, created standing infantry units, and introduced artillery with strategic intelligence. His campaigns against the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan were decisive, brutal, and transformative. With their fall, Russia gained control of the Volga River, opening trade, securing borders, and expanding influence eastward. The empire was growing, and so was Ivan's belief that he was right. Victory has a psychological effect on leaders. It quiets doubt while amplifying conviction. Each success reinforced Ivan's internal narrative. I alone see clearly. I alone protect Russia. This is where brilliance begins to mutate. Ivan was not ignorant of fear. He simply believed he had mastered it. He read extensively, debated theology, and wrote letters filled with philosophical depth. He was articulate, introspective, and capable of extraordinary empathy when he chose to be. But empathy under absolute power becomes selective. Those who agreed were wise. Those who questioned were suspect. Those who opposed were dangerous. Slowly, Ivan's reforms shifted from shared vision to personal authority. Advisors were no longer collaborators. They were instruments. When they resisted his impulses or questioned his wars, Ivan interpreted caution as betrayal. This is the psychological trap of power, the inability to distinguish dissent from disloyalty. The Livonian War marked the beginning of this fracture. What began as a calculated expansion toward the Baltic Sea turned into a prolonged, exhausting conflict. Victories stalled. Resources drained. Allies faltered. And with each setback, Ivan's old fear resurfaced. Failure, to him, was not strategic. It was personal. During a severe illness in 1553, Ivan demanded loyalty oaths from the boyars, insisting they recognize his infant son as heir. Many hesitated. Some refused. To a rational mind, this was political caution. To Ivan, it was proof. Proof that the court was waiting for his weakness. Proof that betrayal was inevitable. Proof that mercy was foolish. When he recovered, Ivan never forgot. This is where the illusion of control began to crack. The structures he built could not protect him from doubt. Laws could not guarantee loyalty. Victory could not silence suspicion. The crown, once a symbol of purpose, now felt like a target painted on his soul. And then, grief returned. The death of Anastasia had already torn open old wounds. The failures of war poured salt into them. Ivan withdrew, brooded, wrote letters filled with rage and despair. He accused nobles of poisoning his wife, sabotaging his armies, and conspiring against his bloodline. Whether these accusations were true became irrelevant. Power does not require truth, it requires belief. And Ivan believed. The promising Tsar, the reformer, the visionary, was still present. But he was drowning beneath something older, darker, and far more patient. The traumatized child who had learned that power must strike first or be destroyed. The line between protector and persecutor blurred. The crown was no longer a tool. It was becoming a weapon. And Ivan was sharpening it. Chapter 4. Every descent has a moment where resistance ends. For Ivan IV, it was not one betrayal, nor one death, nor one failure, but the convergence of all three. Trauma does not explode. It accumulates. And when it finally collapses inward, it leaves nothing untouched. By the early 1560s, the crown no longer steadied Ivan's mind. It pressed down on it. The Livonian War dragged on without glory. Once trusted generals failed him. Advisors urged restraint. Nobles whispered behind closed doors. To an empire, these were signs of strain. To Ivan, they were echoes of childhood, men plotting while he stood alone. And then came the illness. Ivan fell gravely sick, convinced he was dying. In this vulnerable state, he demanded loyalty oaths to his infant son. Several boyars hesitated, fearing instability, fearing a child ruler, fearing chaos. Their hesitation was reasonable. But reason has no language in a paranoid mind. Ivan recovered, but something in him did not. From that point forward, loyalty was no longer assumed. It had to be proven. Repeatedly. Violently. And then grief struck again. Anastasia's death, years earlier, had left a scar that never healed. Ivan had loved her not as a Tsar, but as a frightened man clings to stability. Her presence softened his rages, tempered his suspicion. Without her, his emotional world collapsed inward. He became obsessed with the idea that she had been poisoned. Not if, but by whom. Every boyar became a suspect. Every advisor a potential murderer. Every delay, every mistake, every disagreement, evidence of treason. This is the psychological pivot, when grief turns outward and demands punishment. Ivan withdrew from Moscow, staging a dramatic abdication in 1564. He left the capital and retreated to Alexandrov-Sloboda, sending letters accusing the nobility and clergy of betrayal and corruption. The message was clear: Russia had failed him. The people panicked. The church intervened. Delegations begged him to return. Ivan agreed, on one condition: absolute power. What followed was not governance. It was obsession given structure. In 1565, Ivan created the Oprichnina, a state within a state. A personal domain under his direct control, enforced by a private army loyal only to him. These men, the Oprichniki, dressed in black, rode black horses, and carried symbols of death, severed dog heads and brooms. To sniff out treason. To sweep it away. Psychologically, the Oprichnina was Ivan's mind externalized. A mechanism to hunt imagined enemies before they could strike. It was not about justice. It was about preemption. Fear became policy. The Oprichniki seized land, executed nobles, tortured families, and destroyed entire bloodlines. Confessions were extracted through agony. Guilt was assumed. Innocence was irrelevant. And Ivan watched. Sometimes he prayed. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he participated. The most infamous act came in Novgorod. Convinced the city was plotting to defect, Ivan unleashed his terror upon it. For weeks, the Oprichniki tortured, drowned, burned, and slaughtered thousands. Men, women, children, no distinction. Churches were looted. Monks were killed. The city was broken. This was not strategy. This was projection. Every enemy Ivan could not identify inside his mind was slaughtered outside it. And yet, terror did not bring peace. It only isolated him further. The court became silent. Advisors told him what he wanted to hear. Truth vanished. Fear replaced counsel. The more Ivan punished betrayal, the more betrayal he imagined. Power had done what trauma always feared. It had cut him off from humanity. Then came the final, irreversible act. In 1581, during an argument, some say over politics, others over his son's wife, Ivan struck his eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, in a fit of rage. The blow was fatal. The air collapsed, and the Tsar realized what he had done. Accounts describe Ivan screaming, holding his dying son, begging God to undo the moment. But history does not rewind. Power does not forgive. This was the ultimate psychological cost. He had destroyed the future he feared losing. The terror he unleashed on the world had turned inward, and it would never leave him again. Chapter 5. After the death of his son, Ivan the Terrible did not recover. He existed. The man who had ruled through terror, who had bent nobles and cities to his will, now found himself confronted by something no crown could command: irreversible consequence. Power could erase enemies, rewrite laws, silence dissent. But it could not resurrect the dead. And it could not quiet the mind that knew it was responsible. From this point forward, Ivan's reign was no longer driven by fear of betrayal alone. It was driven by guilt. Chroniclers describe him as physically deteriorating: swollen limbs, trembling hands, unpredictable fits of rage followed by hours of sobbing prayer. He oscillated between extreme religious devotion and explosive cruelty, fasting obsessively one day, ordering executions the next. This was not contradiction, it was psychological fragmentation. When a ruler believes he is both God's chosen instrument and God's greatest sinner, the mind fractures. Ivan surrounded himself with priests, monks, relics, and rituals. He confessed constantly, wrote penitential letters, and engaged in acts of dramatic self-humiliation. Yet repentance brought no relief. The ghosts did not leave. Because repentance without accountability becomes performance. The Oprichnina, once his greatest weapon, had already been dissolved. It had served its purpose, and failed. It had not protected him from betrayal. It had not secured peace. It had not saved his family. All it left behind was a scarred land and a ruler alone with his thoughts. This is the paradox of absolute power. The more control you exert, the fewer places you can hide from yourself. Ivan grew suspicious of everyone again, but now the suspicion was hollow. There was no strategy left, no vision, only reaction. Punishments were erratic. Favor shifted unpredictably. The court lived in permanent tension, unsure whether the Tsar would pray with them or destroy them by nightfall. He wrote letters to foreign rulers filled with grandiosity and despair. He mocked kings, boasted of divine authority, then collapsed into lamentations about sin and damnation. His mind oscillated between omnipotence and worthlessness, a classic psychological collapse when identity is fused entirely with power. Without power, he was nothing. With power, he was unbearable to himself. The death of his heir sealed Russia's fate as well. His remaining son, Fedor, was weak and unprepared. Ivan knew this. He had destroyed the one future that might have justified the bloodshed. The realization haunted him. The crown had not protected his dynasty. It had ended it. In his final years, Ivan became obsessed with prophecy and omens. He feared death yet invited it through excess, paranoia, and exhaustion. He demanded astrologers predict his fate, then punished them when the answers displeased him. Because even fate, to Ivan, felt like betrayal. In 1584, Ivan collapsed while playing chess. Some say stroke. Others whisper poison. Either way, the end came quietly, almost mockingly, for a man who ruled through chaos. There were no triumphant final words. No redemption. No absolution. Only silence. And in that silence remains the lesson history whispers but rarely confronts directly. Ivan the Terrible was not destroyed by enemies. He was not undone by rebellion. He was not defeated by war. He was crushed by the very power he believed would save him. Power magnified his trauma. Power rewarded his paranoia. Power removed every limit that might have stopped him from becoming himself. And in the end, the crown did exactly what trauma had always threatened to do. It took everything. Chapter 6. Ivan the Terrible did not leave behind a mystery. He left behind a warning. When historians debate Ivan the Terrible, they often argue over numbers: how many died, how much land was gained or lost, whether the massacres were exaggerated. But those questions miss the deeper truth. Ivan's story is not primarily about Russia. It is about what happens when absolute power meets unresolved trauma. Ivan was not born cruel. He was shaped by neglect, humiliation, and fear. And when power finally came to him, it did not correct those wounds, it gave them permission. Every insecurity gained authority. Every suspicion gained weapons. Every emotional impulse gained legal force. This is the psychological cost no crown advertises. Power removes friction. In ordinary lives, fear is checked by consequence. Rage is restrained by law. Paranoia is softened by feedback. But absolute power dissolves these barriers. It creates an echo chamber where the mind hears only itself, and mistakes that echo for truth. Ivan believed he was defending Russia. In reality, he was defending his wounded inner child. The Oprichnina was not a policy, it was a coping mechanism. The massacres were not strategy, they were emotional discharge. The executions were not justice, they were reassurance. Reassurance that he was still in control. Yet control, when pursued without self-knowledge, becomes self-destruction. Ivan's greatest tragedy is not the blood he spilled, but the future he erased. By killing his own son, he severed the continuity of his rule and plunged Russia into chaos. The time of troubles followed: civil war, famine, foreign invasion. The terror did not end with him. It echoed. And this is the final cost of power abused. Its damage outlives the ruler. Ivan died feared, not respected. Powerful, yet empty. Crowned, yet alone. His reign expanded borders but collapsed trust. His legacy is not strength, it is instability. The crown he fought to protect consumed his mind, his family, and his nation. And Ivan is not unique. History repeats this pattern relentlessly. Whenever power is concentrated without accountability, whenever leaders mistake fear for loyalty, whenever trauma is mistaken for destiny. The lesson is not that power corrupts. That is too simple. The truth is darker. Power reveals what was never healed. In Ivan's case, it revealed fear that became law, grief that became punishment, suspicion that became genocide, and guilt that arrived too late to save anything. This is why history matters. Not to glorify tyrants, not to sensationalize violence, but to understand the psychological cost we ignore when we worship authority without restraint. Because every crown has weight, and not every mind can survive it. Ivan the Terrible ruled an empire, yet died imprisoned by his own mind. His story leaves us with a haunting question. What do you believe is the greatest psychological burden of absolute power, fear, isolation, paranoia, or the inability to be wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read them, and your perspective might change how someone else sees power. If this story made you pause, reflect, or feel unsettled, press like. It helps this channel reach others who are searching for deeper truths. And if you want more stories where history, psychology, and darkness collide, subscribe to Whispers of the Owls. Because some stories aren't meant to comfort us. They are meant to wake us up. Until the next whisper.